The young man in 14C didn't even look back when he slammed his seat into full recline. He just reached up, adjusted his AirPods, and laughed at something on his phone. The old man in 15C, the one in the worn khaki jacket who'd been sitting perfectly still since Dallas, absorbed the impact without a word. His knees pressed into the seat back. He shifted just slightly, wincing in a way that most people would have missed. Most people did miss it, but one person didn't. What happened 40 minutes later, when a passenger in a general's uniform walked out of first class and stopped cold in the aisle, would leave every person in that section of the plane unable to speak. 3 of them were still thinking about it a year later. One of them, the young man in 14C, would never stop. If you believe the men who served this country deserve better, leave the word honor in the comments. His name was Vincent Arlo Kessler, 76 years old, with a face weathered enough to tell you something had worn it down. Not age exactly, but something older than age. He had a white beard trimmed close, the kind a man keeps not for style, but because shaving had become an unnecessary effort. His jacket was khaki canvas, soft with decades of washing, the kind of thing a sporting goods store sold for $30 in 1987 and no longer carried. The only thing on it was a small American flag pin on the lapel, the kind you could buy at any dollar store. He wasn't advertising anything, he never had. He'd booked the middle seat in row 15 because it was $11 cheaper than the window. He was flying from Dallas to Boston to see his great niece, Clara, graduate from nursing school. He hadn't told Clara much about the flight. He hadn't told Clara much about anything, really. That was just who Vincent Kessler was. He'd been born in Amarillo, Texas, in 1950, the second of 4 children, raised by a mother who sewed curtains for other people's houses and a father who drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. He'd enlisted at 18 because his older brother had, and because the recruiter said the army needed medics, and because Vincent Kessler had always been the kind of person who moved toward the thing that hurt instead of away from it. He did 2 tours in Vietnam. He came home in 1971 and never talked about it. Not to his family, not to anyone. He got his nursing certification, worked 30 years in a county hospital in rural Montana, retired, moved back to Texas. He lived alone now in a house outside Amarillo with a small garden and a dog named Birch who slept across his feet every night. He watched the Weather Channel in the evenings because the forecasters had calm voices and never asked anything of him. The men on the flight with him, Colton Webb and his 2 colleagues, had been loud since the gate. They were in their mid-20s, still riding the high of a successful conference in Dallas, the kind of energy that fills a space and assumes everyone else will simply make room. Webb had the window seat in row 14. He was tall, good-looking in the practiced way of someone told so often enough to rely on it, wearing the soft clothes of someone who had never needed to worry about dress codes because the dress codes existed for people like him. He'd noticed Kessler when they boarded, not really the way you notice furniture. Old man, khaki jacket, middle seat, nobody. 20 minutes into the flight, the cabin had settled into the particular rhythm of routine travel. The drink cart had come and gone. The seatbelt sign was off. Webb reached up, found the recline button and pushed it without a second thought. The way you'd scratch an itch. The mechanism hit Kessler's knees first, then compressed against his left leg. Kessler had a piece of shrapnel still lodged near his left femur that hadn't been worth the surgery to remove in 1971, and still wasn't. The pressure from the seatback found it immediately, the way cold finds old injuries. He didn't make a sound. He leaned forward and pressed the call button on Webb's headrest, the polite signal to ask someone to bring their seat up slightly. Webb looked back, pulled one AirPod out. "Yeah?" "I'm sorry to bother you," Kessler said. His voice was quiet, a little rough, like gravel settling after something heavy had passed over it. "Would you mind bringing your seat up just a bit? My leg?" "I paid for the full recline, man." Webb said it almost pleasantly, which was some worse than if he'd been annoyed. He turned back to his screen. Kessler's jaw moved once. Then he folded his hands in his lap, adjusted as best he could against the pain that was now a steady presence, and looked at the headrest in front of him. One of Webb's colleagues across the aisle in 14D had heard the exchange. He said something to Webb in a low voice. Webb glanced back again at Kessler, amused in the way of someone who finds the situation self-explanatory. Then he said it louder, performing it for his friends. "Maybe fly first class next time, old-timer. They give you a lot more room up there." The other one, the quiet one, looked at his laptop and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Nobody nearby said anything. The flight attendant was 6 rows forward, helping someone with a bag. Inside his jacket pocket, Kessler's right hand closed around a folded envelope, without him realizing he'd reached for it. He did that sometimes, touched the envelope the way a man checks his wallet, just to confirm it's there. The envelope had a Department of Defense return address. Inside was a letter from the Office of the Secretary of the Army, informing him that a new field trauma training facility at Fort Sam, Houston, would be dedicated in his name in 3 weeks. He had not yet responded to confirm whether he would attend. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He wasn't sure what he would say to a room full of people looking at him, like he was supposed to explain something. He let go of the envelope and looked at the small oval window across the aisle. Texas had given way below them. The land out there was enormous and flat and indifferent, which he'd always found more comforting than people generally did. He tried to think about Clara, about the bakery in the South End he'd ordered the cake from, whether Boston in October would be cold enough that she'd need the jacket he'd thought to bring as a gift. He tried not to think about 1968. He was mostly successful. 40 minutes out of Dallas, a short burst of turbulence moved through the plane. Brief, choppy, the kind that jostles drinks and gives white-knuckle flyers 30 seconds of private arithmetic about the odds. When it settled, the first-class curtain moved and a tall man stepped through. He was perhaps 62, with silver hair cut the way military men cut it. Not short for fashion, but short for function, a habit of decades. He wore a United States Army dress uniform with 2 stars on the collar, a Major General, active duty, going somewhere official. His ribbons were stacked 4 rows high on his chest, the kind of rack that takes 30 years to build medal by medal and decoration by decoration, each one representing something that happened in a real place at a real cost. He moved through the aisle with the careful economy of a man who had spent his career in confined spaces. Helicopters, fobs, command posts, his eyes taking in everything around him, the way trained eyes do, automatically without effort. His name was Malcolm Ashby. He had been a young lieutenant in 1988 when his battalion commander gathered his platoon and showed them a photograph. Black and white, taken by an embedded photojournalist in Hue City, 1968. In the photograph, a young army medic, barely 19, his uniform soaked through, his face carrying the specific expressionlessness that comes not from calm but from having moved past the place where fear is useful, was crossing an open courtyard with 2 men over his shoulders simultaneously, one on each side, moving toward a rescue point while the building behind him was actively on fire. The journalist who took that photograph won a Pulitzer Prize. The medic in it received the Medal of Honor. Malcolm Ashby had kept that photograph framed on the wall of every office he'd occupied in 34 years of service. He showed it to every officer he ever trained. He had never met the man in it. He made his way down the aisle toward the restroom at the rear, nodding briefly to passengers who recognized the uniform. In row 15, he slowed, then stopped. The old man in the middle seat had shifted in his sleep, or what looked like sleep, and a small envelope had worked partway out of his jacket pocket. Ashby's eyes moved to the return address out of old habit. Department of Defense, Office of the Secretary of the Army. The letter protruded just enough to show the top line of the letterhead and the first few words below it. A name, and beside it, fallen loose from inside the envelope, a photograph lying face up on the old man's knee. It was black and white. There was a burning building. There were 2 men being carried, one over each shoulder. There was a 19-year-old face, expressionless with exhaustion, moving forward. Malcolm Ashby stood very still in the aisle of a commercial aircraft at 34,000 feet. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the old man sleeping beneath it, at the white beard and the weathered face and the khaki jacket and the small flag pin on the lapel. And he understood, with a certainty that moved through him like electrical current, that it was the same face. 57 years older, carrying 57 more years of weight, but the same face. His throat worked once. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Kessler's eyes opened. He looked up without alarm, the look of a man who had stopped being startled by things a very long time ago. Ashby's voice came out with great care, like something being handled with both hands. "Sir, is your name Vincent Kessler?" The old man went still in a specific way. Not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of someone who has just heard the thing they'd been half expecting and half dreading. Something passed through his eyes, not surprise, more like the quiet resignation of an inevitability arriving on schedule. "Yes," he said. "Major General Malcolm Ashby, United States Army, holder of the Distinguished Service Medal and the Legion of Merit and 14 other decorations, built from 3.5 decades of decisions in hard places, came to attention in the aisle of that airplane." His hand came up in a salute so precise and deliberate it looked almost suspended in the air, held there committed to. "Sir," he said, and his voice was no longer careful, "I have wanted to meet you for 34 years. The cabin went quiet around them, the way quiet happens in a public space when something unexpected and serious is occurring nearby, not all at once, but spreading outward, one person at a time going still. A woman in 16A stopped reading. The man beside her looked up from his crossword. Colton Webb had both AirPods out now. His colleague's laptop sat idle, screen dim. Kessler looked at the salute for a long moment, the way a man looks at something that costs him something to receive. Then, slowly, he raised his right hand and returned it. His arm wasn't entirely straight. An old injury had taken some of the range and never given it back, but the gesture carried everything a gesture could carry. It was not a performance. It was an acknowledgement between two people who understood what it meant. "At ease, General," he said softly, "please." Ashby lowered his hand but didn't move from the aisle. He said, "Sir, with your permission, I need to say something to the people around you." Kessler looked at him steadily. "General, I didn't come here for—" "I know you didn't." Ashby's voice was level. "You never do, that's exactly why I'm asking." A long pause. The plane moved through the sky above Tennessee or Kentucky or wherever they were, indifferent to the conversation happening in row 15. Kessler looked at the headrest in front of him for a moment. Then he gave a small nod, not enthusiastic, but real, and looked back at his hands. Ashby turned to address the rows immediately surrounding them. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spoken to soldiers the morning before they went into things they might not come back from, and who knew the difference between words that mattered and words that didn't. "My name is Major General Malcolm Ashby. I'm going to take 1 minute of your time." The section settled into complete silence. "The man in seat 15C is Staff Sergeant Vincent Arlo Kessler, United States Army, retired. He served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic. On February 17, 1968, during the Battle of Hue City, his unit's field hospital came under enemy attack. The building caught fire, the situation became untenable. The medical staff and most of the soldiers in the area withdrew to a defensible position, which was the correct tactical decision. Every person there made a reasonable choice." He paused. Staff Sergeant Kessler made a different one. Webb had turned around in his seat completely. His phone was in the seat pocket, forgotten. He went back into that building. He came out carrying a wounded Marine over each shoulder. He went back in. He came out with 2 more. He did this 11 times over the course of 2 hours while the structure burned around him, while enemy fire made the courtyard an active kill zone, and while he himself had shrapnel wounds in his left leg, wounds he had not reported, because reporting them would have pulled him off duty and he was not finished. Ashby's voice had lost some of its evenness. He found it again before continuing. He brought 11 men out of that building, 11 men who would not otherwise have survived. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Nixon in 1971. He accepted it, thanked the president, and returned to work. In 14D, one of Webb's colleagues had pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. He never gave a speech about it. He has never appeared on television. He has never sought recognition of any kind from this country he spent his youth bleeding for. He earned his nursing license when he came home and spent 30 years driving hundreds of miles to reach patients in rural Montana counties where no one else wanted to practice, patients who couldn't afford the gas to come to him, so he went to them. He charged what people could pay. He is on this flight today in a middle seat, traveling to watch his great-niece graduate from nursing school. Ashby's voice dropped slightly on the last sentence. He ordered her a cake from a bakery in Boston, because he remembered she mentioned once that she liked lemon. The plane was very quiet. "I have had a photograph of this man on my office wall since 1988, Ashby said. "I have shown it to every officer I have ever had the privilege of training. I told all of them the same thing. This is what service looks like. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the recognition. The choice, the single private unremarkable choice, to go back in when no one would have blamed you for doing otherwise. He stopped. He let the silence be. Then he turned to face Colton Webb directly, and his voice changed register, still controlled, but with an edge underneath it, the edge of someone saying a thing that needs to be said. Earlier in this flight, this man asked you, quietly and politely, to bring your seat up slightly because his leg was hurting. You refused. You made a joke of it. He let that exist for a moment without embellishment. You didn't know who he was. I understand that. I'm not here to tell you that his record changes how you should have treated him. He held Webb's gaze steadily. I'm here to tell you that it doesn't matter. You should have treated him with basic human decency, because he was an elderly man in pain sitting behind you, and that's all the reason you ever need. His history is not what you failed. Your own character is what you failed, and only you can fix that. Webb's face had gone the colour of the white headrest beside him. His hands were still on the armrests. He was not looking away. Ashby wasn't finished. You're young. I don't say that to diminish you. I say it because it means you have time, real time, to decide who you're going to be in all the moments where no one is forcing you to be anything. The man behind you has been deciding that, quietly, without an audience, for 50 years. That's where character actually lives. He glanced back at Kessler once. Not in the big moments, in the ordinary ones. Webb swallowed. Then he turned in his seat to face Kessler directly, and his voice, when it came, was barely above a murmur. Sir, he said, I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry. There's no excuse for any of it. Kessler, who had been looking at the headrest throughout all of this with the patient stillness of a man absorbing something he had not asked for and would not have chosen, turned his head and looked at Webb. It was a slow look, unhurried, carrying neither contempt nor performance, just clarity. Son, he said. His voice was level, not cold, not warm, something more durable than either. I'm not angry with you. Anger is a thing I put down a long time ago. I couldn't carry it and still do the work I wanted to do. Had to choose one. Webb was leaned around his headrest fully now, facing backward, listening. There's one thing I learned that took me too long to learn, Kessler said. I'll give it to you for free since we've got time. He looked at his hands folded in his lap. The shrapnel in his leg was a dull, familiar ache now. He'd lived with it so long, it was almost like an old acquaintance he'd made an uneasy peace with. I used to think strength meant being able to do hard things, run into a building, carry more weight than the next man, go back when everything reasonable said to stay. I thought that was the definition. He paused. The engines hummed. Somewhere behind them a child made a small sound and went quiet. But that's not strength, that's physics. Given enough adrenaline and necessity, almost anyone can do hard things in a crisis. The body surprises you. What the body does in a moment of emergency, that's not who you are. He looked at Webb steadily. Who you are is the person you are when nothing is forcing you to be anything in particular. When you're comfortable and the other person can't fight back and it would cost you nothing to be decent and nothing to be unkind. That's the moment that counts. Not the burning building. The airplane seat. His eyes held Webb's with something that was not severity, but something deeper than that. The weight of a man who had paid for this understanding with his body, and was now offering it without charge to someone who might still benefit from it. That moment will come for you thousands of times in your life. In a meeting with a subordinate, with a stranger in pain behind you on a flight from Dallas. Every time it comes, you're building something or you're tearing it down, one choice at a time. He stopped. That was everything he had to say. He didn't repeat it or soften it or add a qualifier. I don't need your apology, he said quietly. I need you to remember it. Webb's jaw worked. His eyes were bright and he was not hiding it. I will, he said. I promise I will, sir. General Ashby crouched beside Kessler's seat. The gesture was deliberate, choosing to be at the same level. When he spoke, his voice was for Kessler alone. Sir, there's a seat open in first class. I would consider it a personal honour if you'd take it. Kessler began to shake his head. Vincent, the first name quiet and direct, please. The old man in the khaki jacket looked at the general crouched beside him. The stars, the ribbons, the face of a man who had been building his entire career in the direction of a photograph taken before he was born. And something in his expression shifted, just enough. All right, General, he said. "All right." Ashby helped him to his feet. The shrapnel flared when he stood, the way it always did when he'd been sitting too long, and he absorbed it without comment. Around them, passengers who had heard the story were standing, not uniformly, not with choreography, but with the organic, slightly awkward sincerity of real people responding to something real. A woman in the aisle seat reached out and touched Kessler's arm as he passed, just briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it's solid. An older man near the back, white-haired, the kind of old that recognizes other kinds of old, brought himself to something close to attention. Kessler moved through them at the pace, his leg allowed, which was not fast, and which he'd made his peace with years ago. He nodded to those who nodded. He didn't perform. He didn't look at the floor either. He moved through the acknowledgement of strangers the way a man weathers unexpected weather, straight through it, without stopping. At the first-class curtain he paused and looked back at Webb one last time. Webb had gotten to his feet without knowing exactly when he'd decided to. His colleagues were standing too, all three of them, in the aisle, facing forward. Kessler looked at them in turn. "Serve something larger than yourselves," he said simply. "Whatever that is. It doesn't have to look the way mine looked. It just has to be real, and it has to cost you something, or it doesn't count." He held their eyes for one more moment. Take care of each other when it gets hard. That part matters most. Then he turned and stepped through the curtain. The first-class flight attendant had heard enough through the galley partition to understand what was happening. She guided him to the front window seat without a word about it, brought him a blanket and water, and left him to the quiet. Some things don't need commentary. General Ashby settled into the adjacent seat. They talked, for the remaining flight time, about small things. Clara's nursing program, what she'd specialized in, the garden in Amarillo, whether Birch the dog was manageable with the neighbor who checked on him. Kessler described the cake he'd ordered, lemon with white frosting, because Clara had mentioned it once in passing, years ago, and he'd written it down in the small notebook he kept for things worth remembering. Ashby listened. He asked questions that were genuine, not ceremonial. They were two people on a plane talking about the things that make up a life, which is the most ordinary and least ordinary thing in the world. When the plane landed at Logan and the seatbelt sign chimed off, Ashby made a brief call from the gate bridge. He kept it short. A few words, a location, a time. Gate B14 at Logan International looked like a standard arrival gate. Most of the passengers from the flight were already moving toward baggage claim or connecting gates when Kessler came through the jet bridge. 6 people were waiting at the gate who hadn't been waiting for anyone else. 3 were airport staff, standing quietly with the specific composure of people who have been told something that changed their posture. 2 were men in their 70s, VFW caps, hands folded at their waists. The 6th person was a young woman in a nursing graduation gown, still slightly creased from the drive over, dark hair pulled back, holding a white bakery box in both hands. Clara Kessler-Walsh had gotten a call from a number she didn't recognize 40 minutes earlier. A man identifying himself as a general who said there was a something she should know about her great-uncle before she saw him. She had listened for 8 minutes in the parking structure at Logan, sitting in her car, not moving. Then she had picked up the bakery order herself. She saw him come through the jet bridge, saw the general a half step behind, saw the 2 VFW men draw themselves up, saw the airport staff go still. She had known Vincent Kessler her entire life as the quiet one, the one who sent birthday cards with a check inside, who called on Christmas morning before anyone else was up, who sat in the back at every family gathering and left before the photographs were taken. The one her mother described when Clara was young and asked why he never talked about himself, as someone who had seen hard things, in a tone that closed the subject permanently. She had never pushed, he had never offered, and so there was a version of her great-uncle she had carried her whole life that was, she understood now, the smallest fraction of the actual thing. He came to her the way he always had, directly without preamble. She said his name. Her voice didn't make it all the way out. He hugged her. Canvas jacket, the smell of something old and clean, the 2 pats on the back he always gave. Then he stepped back and looked at her face and her gown and the bakery box in her hands, and his permanent almost smile was present in the small creases around his eyes. "You look like you belong in that," he said. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was finding itself Any of it. Why didn't you ever tell me? He considered the question the way he considered most questions, genuinely, without rushing to fill the silence with something easier than the truth. Then he said, "Because the things I did don't explain who I am. And because what you're doing," he nodded at the gown, the box, the decision she had made to spend her life moving toward people in pain rather than away from them, "that's not separate from any of it, that's the continuation of it. Every person you help is part of a line that runs back farther than you know." He took her arm as they walked. "The point was never the burning building," he said after a moment. "The point was what comes after it. The next person who needs somebody to run toward them. You're that person for a lot of people, Clara. That's the whole thing." She held onto his arm and didn't try to say anything that would be adequate to the moment because nothing would have been. Behind them, in the terminal, Colton Webb moved through a different concourse toward the rideshare exit. He didn't check his phone. He didn't talk to his colleagues. He walked through the automatic doors into the grey October afternoon and stood at the curb and looked at nothing in particular for a long time. He thought about a 19-year-old going back into a burning building 11 times. He thought about the moment before the first time, when the building was already on fire and every rational calculation said otherwise, and the young medic from Amarillo, Texas, had simply decided to go back in anyway, not because anyone ordered him, not because he was sure he'd survive, but because there were men in there, and he could. He thought about all the much smaller versions of that decision that would come in his own life, in conference rooms, and on airplanes, and at dinner tables, and at every ordinary intersection where a person gets the quiet, unannounced opportunity to decide who they actually are. He stood there for a long time. He still thinks about it.